The words were stark. Immediate. Threatening. But the handwriting, careful, almost elegant, suggested someone who wanted control, not chaos. Someone who understood the rules, and how to bend them without breaking them entirely. And then, the real loop. The moment that would echo through every conversation, every corridor, every whispered rumor on Capitol Hill, was that this was just the beginning. No one knew it yet. But the gears were already turning. The press hadn't arrived. The staffers were frozen in half-formed routines. The politicians were miles away, debating things they didn't yet realize were irrelevant. And in that quiet, calculated pause, a single truth emerged: something hidden was about to surface, and no one was prepared. By mid-morning, Capitol Hill looked normal again. The sun glinted off windows. Commuters passed through security gates. Phones buzzed. Emails arrived. Meetings started. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Because the envelope had been opened. The move had been made. And the players, seen and unseen, were now aware: someone had stepped onto the board. And the real story hadn't even started. He wasn't always in this position. Not even close. Years earlier, he had walked streets that smelled of exhaust and diner coffee. Neon lights flickered over cracked sidewalks. He'd watched the world through a window of late-night television, dreaming bigger than the city itself. Dreams that seemed impossible, even ridiculous. You know this feeling. That quiet yearning you carry when no one is looking. When everything around you tells you, stay small. He had scars. Not the kind you see on skin. Invisible ones. Childhood wounds, whispered failures, private fears. They shaped him. They fueled him. And they were the secret engine behind every decision he made now. But it wasn't just personal ambition. Something deeper had begun to stir, a pattern he didn't fully understand. A sense that the world could be nudged, moved, manipulated, without anyone realizing. And that power, subtle as it was, had a rhythm. He studied systems like a craftsman studies his tools. The corridors of power, the networks of influence, the quiet pulses behind headlines, they fascinated him. Every whisper, every glance, every small gesture told a story he could read if he only paid attention. And he did. But something in him was shifting. He just didn't know what was coming. There were contradictions, of course. He craved attention but feared exposure. He thrived in chaos but sought control. He built walls around himself, yet wanted the world to see. You felt this before, haven't you? That push and pull between who you are and who you want to be. His mornings began early, not with meetings or briefings, but with observation. Highways glimmering under the first light. Traffic patterns. Security guards' routines. Even the hum of city lights at night. Every detail was a note in a song only he seemed to hear. And yet, there was still imperfection. Mistakes. Missteps. Moments where the world ignored him, mocked him, or laughed at what he tried to accomplish. Those moments didn't stop him, they refined him. Hardened him. Taught him patience. Taught him timing. Taught him the power of subtlety. At diners, he watched conversations like a spectator at a theater. Ordinary people, ordinary struggles, ordinary triumphs. And somewhere in their stories, he found lessons no book could teach. Small revelations that would later shape the moves on Capitol Hill. By now, you're beginning to see it, this wasn't just a story about one person. It was about a mindset. A method. A quiet insistence that the world could be influenced if you understood the rules before anyone else even knew they existed. And even then, he hadn't fully realized the storm he was about to step into. Because power, he would soon learn, wasn't just about control. It was about timing. Precision. And the courage to move when everyone else still slept. You felt this too, haven't you? That moment when everything seems calm, but something in the air tells you the tide is turning. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. And the first move, the move that would ripple across Capitol Hill, was waiting to be made. But the real story hadn't even started. At first, everything looked normal. Reports arrived. Briefings were delivered. Staffers moved between offices like cogs in a well-oiled machine. Nothing out of place. The corridors of power carried on as if the world outside didn't matter. But then a single detail fractured everything. A memo, overlooked by most, landed on the wrong desk. Just a few lines of text, but enough to ignite questions, doubts, suspicions. Eyes darted. Phones buzzed. Whispers started, soft at first, then growing, stretching across offices and hallways. You know this feeling. That sudden awareness that something isn't right. That the rules have shifted. But you can't yet say how. By sunrise, the corridors of Capitol Hill were quiet. Too quiet. The usual hum of staffers, the clatter of papers, the distant chatter from committee rooms, it was gone. Vanished. Replaced by a low, creeping tension. Something had shifted. Something no one could name. A single envelope lay on the polished marble floor. Its edges were crisp, unnaturally so, as if it had been delivered with care but meant to unsettle. Someone noticed it. Then another. Soon, whispers traveled faster than footsteps. "You shouldn't touch that," a voice hissed. But it was already too late. Fingers hovered, curiosity tugging at the edges of caution. Eyes darted to the shadows. Every glance felt like a question. Every pause, a warning. No one knew where it came from. No one knew who it was meant for. And yet, everyone sensed the same thing: this wasn't ordinary. Not by a long shot. Outside, the sun rose over the Washington skyline. Its light stretched across the city in long, thin fingers. The streets below were beginning to stir, taxis, joggers, late commuters, but inside, time seemed to hold its breath. Someone tried to call a supervisor. The line was busy. Then dead. And when the first door clicked shut, the sound echoed like a gunshot in the empty hall. By then, the message was clear: this was no accident. In the next room, a figure moved with quiet precision. Not running, not panicking. Just moving. Every step deliberate. Every glance measured. The kind of movement that makes a room feel smaller than it is. You know this feeling. You've seen it before, haven't you? That sudden awareness that something is happening around you, something bigger than yourself, something no one else can see yet. The envelope was opened. Inside, a simple note. But simple doesn't mean harmless. It read: "Watch closely. The first move has been made." He watched it all unfold quietly. Not panicking, not celebrating. Just observing. Every reaction, every hesitation, every small sign of panic was a note in a symphony only he could hear. And the moral pressure began to mount. Expectations collided with reality. Allies questioned motives. Opponents sensed advantage. The narrative everyone thought was fixed started to unravel. At first, it seemed small, a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. But the cracks spread quietly. Meetings were postponed. Emails went unanswered. The rhythm of the day became jagged, irregular, unpredictable. And then came the contradictions. Statements were issued that contradicted one another. Policies appeared to shift overnight. What was promised yesterday became forbidden today. The very definition of normal seemed to bend under unseen weight. The real danger wasn't the change itself, it was who controlled it. You've seen this before, haven't you? When the rules change, subtly at first, until you wake up one morning and realize everything you relied on is in question. Outside the offices, the city went on. Morning traffic. Coffee shops. Runners along the National Mall. Life moved in ordinary rhythms. But inside, tension coiled tighter, waiting for the spark that would set the first domino falling. And then, the spark arrived. A phone call. A meeting. A single decision that forced people to choose sides. Suddenly, alliances shifted. Conversations were interrupted. Eyes searched for answers that weren't there. At that moment, the lesson became clear: power wasn't just about who moved first. It was about understanding who noticed, and who didn't. At first glance, it was chaos. But it was calculated. Precise. Like a game of chess played in dim light, with pieces no one outside the room could see. And for those who tried to ignore it, who tried to act as if the world was unchanged, the consequences were immediate. Confusion spread. Confidence faltered. Control slipped through fingers like sand. By mid-afternoon, Capitol Hill was alive in a new way. Not with celebration, not with routine, but with tension. A hum of suspicion that made even the most experienced staffers glance over their shoulders. And yet, the real story hadn't even started. Because underneath the noise, the hidden system was working. Every misstep, every misunderstanding, every overlooked detail, it was part of a larger design, invisible to most, but entirely visible to him. And that is where the tension lived. Not in the chaos itself, but in the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was always 2 steps ahead. By late afternoon, the corridors of Capitol Hill no longer felt familiar. What appeared to be routine meetings, policy debates, and paperwork was something else entirely. Something orchestrated. Something deliberate. And here's the part almost no one saw. The envelope. The memo. The spark that fractured the morning. It wasn't random. It was a signal. A move in a game most weren't even aware was being played. What they called freedom was quiet dependency. What they called control was curated chaos. He had studied the system like a chess master studies the board. Each player, each routine, each assumption had been mapped. Every predictable behavior accounted for. And yet, to everyone else, it looked like disarray. The paradox was simple: the more chaotic it seemed, the more controlled it really was. You know this feeling. That moment when reality twists just enough to make you question what you thought you understood. That moment when you realize the rules aren't broken, they've just been rewritten. The staffers began noticing patterns they couldn't yet articulate. An email sent too late. A phone call that shouldn't have happened. A security clearance misdirected. Each detail minor on its own, but together, forming a lattice no one else could see. What he had discovered months ago, quietly, in the back rooms and late-night research, was coming to life. And the subtlety was the key. Because if people saw the system clearly, they would resist. But if they only glimpsed fragments, they would move unknowingly, exactly as intended. And here's the part almost no one realized: the consequences were not immediate. They were cumulative. Silent. Growing in strength with each passing hour, unnoticed until the storm arrived. The paradox was cruel in its elegance. The truth didn't break people, they broke themselves by misunderstanding it. Outside, the sun dipped behind the Washington skyline, painting windows in gold and shadow. Capitol Hill looked ordinary, almost peaceful. A few staffers laughed over coffee. Phones buzzed with mundane requests. Life went on. But inside, the system moved. A hidden logic dictated who noticed, who hesitated, who acted. And those who thought themselves free were quietly steered. This was more than politics. More than a maneuver on a single day. It was a blueprint. A demonstration of how attention, timing, and subtle signals could shape outcomes before anyone even realized they had a choice. You felt it too, haven't you? That flicker in the corner of your awareness. The sense that someone, somewhere, sees more than you. That the world isn't quite what it seems. And as the first waves of confusion began to ripple through meetings, press updates, and whispered conversations, one undeniable truth emerged. The hidden system was no longer invisible. But the real story hadn't even started. Because knowing the system exists, and understanding it, are two very different things. The storm didn't arrive with thunder. It arrived with screens. One by one, monitors across Capitol Hill flickered, first dimming, then sharpening, revealing headlines, leaks, whispers, interpretations. Not truth. Not lies. Just noise waiting for someone to turn it into meaning. Screens lit up. Voices sharpened. No one agreed on what was real anymore. You know this moment. You felt it in your bones. When the world shifts faster than your understanding can catch it. Phones buzzed with half-formed alerts. Staffers leaned over desks with widening eyes. Aides walked briskly down hallways, clutching folders they didn't understand but were suddenly told were urgent. Outside, reporters gathered like storm clouds, their questions sharp enough to cut through steel. They didn't know the full story, but they sensed blood in the water. They always do. And inside, the figure at the center of it all watched the chaos with a strange stillness. Not fear. Not triumph. Just clarity. Because storms don't confuse the people who create them. They clarify. A door slammed somewhere down the hall. A voice rose. Another one cracked. Someone whispered, "We need answers, now." But answers weren't coming. Not yet. Not in a world where perception meant more than fact, where timing outweighed truth, where silence itself became its own kind of pressure. What he understood, but no one else did, was that storms reveal character. And today, every person on Capitol Hill would face themselves before they faced the truth. A staffer dropped a stack of papers. Another broke into a run. Security tightened around rooms that were empty 10 minutes earlier. Doors locked. Lights blinked. Shadows lengthened. The storm wasn't outside. It was here. In every hesitation, every frantic glance, every breath drawn too quickly. You can silence a voice. You can bury a truth. But you cannot stop a mind that finally learns to question. Those words weren't spoken aloud, but they pulsed through the air, unspoken but unmistakable. A quiet awakening hummed beneath the rising panic, as if people were starting to realize that something far deeper than a memo or a misstep was unfolding. This wasn't about a single action. Or a single person. Or even a single day. It was about understanding how fragile certainty really is. The storm pressed harder. Rumors turned into assumptions. Assumptions turned into narratives. And narratives, once seated, grew into realities no one could control. Meetings devolved into arguments. Arguments into shouts. Shouts into silence. The heavy, suffocating silence of people realizing they might be witnessing something unprecedented, and that they were unprepared. And somewhere, behind a closed door, he stood alone. Listening. Breathing. Calculating. He knew storms were never about destruction. They were about revelation. And in this one, every truth long buried beneath politics, ideology, ego, and fear was clawing its way to the surface. You felt it before, haven't you? That moment right before everything breaks. When the world seems to vibrate with unspoken meaning. The storm had arrived. Not loud, but inevitable. Not destructive, but exposing. And Capitol Hill, built on stone, power, and long-held assumptions, was about to learn the cost of clarity. But the real story hadn't even started. In politics, nothing begins with a bang. It begins with a whisper. And on this night, somewhere between the glow of Capitol Hill's marble corridors and the low hum of midnight security, the whisper takes shape. A message. Not written. Not spoken. Signaled. A senior staffer from a mid-tier committee, someone who normally lives in the gray zone of invisibility, steps out of a conference room carrying a thin, unmarked folder. No logo. No seal. Just weight. The kind of weight that changes behavior when you hold it. He doesn't go to his office. He doesn't go to a secure vault. He goes, upstairs. The place where whispers become strategy. Inside the leadership wing, lights are still on. Phones still warm. Coffee still burning. And in a cramped room with walls stacked floor to ceiling with classified briefers and decades of congressional dust, 3 lawmakers sit in silence. They're not allies. They're not enemies. They're participants. The staffer places the folder on the table. He doesn't explain anything. He doesn't need to. Everyone already knows what it's about. The new instability forming around Ilhan Omar, her recent remarks, the social media storm, the political energy swirling around her name. But tonight is different. Tonight, they sense something moving from reaction to intention. One of the lawmakers, a veteran who's seen more political storms than any living reporter, opens the folder slowly, as if expecting heat to escape. Inside, a series of internal memos. Timeline charts. Communications flagged for unusual patterns. And a set of predictions from a private analytics team that has advised multiple administrations. The room goes still. Because these documents don't describe a scandal. They describe a trajectory. A direction that, if left untouched, could reshape committee dynamics, foreign affairs narratives, and even the rhetorical tone of the 2026 election season. Someone finally breaks the silence. Is this Trump's move? The staffer doesn't answer directly. He simply nods, small, subtle, careful. Because in Washington, truth isn't spoken, it's confirmed through silence. A second lawmaker leans forward. So he's not attacking her, he's positioning around her. Another silence. Another confirmation. This isn't war. This isn't revenge. This is placement. A strategic reshuffling of public perception, done with the softest touch and the largest shadow. Not to destroy a political opponent, because that's loud and predictable. But to create a contrast. A narrative shape. A point of tension that will eventually demand resolution. And in documentary storytelling, just like in politics, contrast is the fuel that powers everything else. The veteran lawmaker closes the folder with a sigh. It's starting, he says quietly. Not the fight. The framing. Outside, the Capitol dome glows pale and watchful, as if listening. Because tonight, a whisper didn't just travel through the building. It changed direction. It pointed. And in Washington, when a whisper points, the whole country eventually hears the echo. In every political storm, before the headlines. Before the outrage. Before the speeches that try to rewrite history in real time. There is always one person who sees the pattern first. Not a senator. Not a strategist. Not even a journalist. But an analyst. A quiet one. The kind who blends into fluorescent-lit rooms and carries a badge that opens fewer doors than you'd expect, but accesses more truth than most people ever see. Her name isn't important. Her job is. She monitors shifts, tone shifts, sentiment shifts, ecosystem shifts, those microscopic tremors in the political landscape that ordinary people miss, but decision-makers fear. And 3 days before the folder appeared in the leadership wing, she noticed something. Not in the public polls. Not in cable news chatter. But deep inside a private data stream used by multiple committees to predict political volatility. A spike. Centered around Ilhan Omar. But not about her comments, her policy statements, or any mistake that could be labeled a scandal. This spike was directional. It wasn't measuring what she said. It was measuring who was paying attention. A demographic shift. Small at first. Then growing. Not activists. Not the usual online echo chambers. But suburban independents and older voters. A group that rarely engages with Omar's orbit, and never this suddenly. The analysts stared at the charts for almost an hour. Not because the numbers were dramatic, but because they were coordinated, as if something had nudged public attention in a subtle, almost invisible way. A pattern with no source. No origin point. She checked for leaks. None. Checked media trends. Nothing. Checked foreign influence indicators. Clean. So she dug deeper. And that's when she found it. A specific cluster of online conversations, scattered across platforms that don't normally overlap, had begun referencing Omar in a context tied to national leadership, geopolitical direction, even American identity. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't supportive. It was comparative. The kind of comparative framing that appears when someone is repositioning the narrative lens. She reran the data 3 times. It kept returning the same anomaly. A slow-building ripple. Omar's name rising not as a controversy, but as a counterweight. A narrative foil. A contrast. A contrast to whom? At first, she couldn't see it. Until she mapped the timeline, overlaying the data spike with political speeches, interviews, and the media cycle. And there it was. Clear. Undeniable. Trump. Not directly. Not obviously. But structurally. As if his orbit had shifted just slightly, enough to cast a new shadow, one that happened to fall directly across Omar's path. Not to attack her. Not to elevate her. But to define himself through her. That's why the analyst escalated it. That's why the folder existed. That's why leadership met at midnight. Because in Washington, a pattern like this doesn't predict scandal. It predicts strategy. And now, that strategy is moving, quietly, deliberately, like a tectonic plate beneath the political landscape. The analyst closes her laptop for the night, unaware that her discovery is already circulating in rooms she'll never enter. Because she didn't just find data. She found the early outline of a narrative shift. A shift that will set the next chapter of the story in motion. Every political escalation, no matter how public it eventually becomes, always starts with one thing. A call no one is supposed to know about. Not recorded. Not logged. Not saved. A call meant to disappear the second it ends. And tonight, that call goes out. Not from Capitol Hill. Not from a campaign office. But from a private residence tucked behind a gated community in Northern Virginia, a place where retired power brokers still hold influence, even if their names no longer appear in the news. The man making the call is not a current official. But he's part of Washington's other government. The network of former advisors, consultants, and back-channel operators who move information the way traders move currency. He dials a secure line. Not encrypted by the government. But encrypted by someone who doesn't advertise their services. The line clicks. No greeting. Just breathing. He starts carefully. It's shifting. The Omar thing. The numbers are real. The person on the other end exhales slowly, as if already expecting this. And Trump, the voice asks. A beat of silence. He's not pushing it, the Virginia man says. He's shaping around it. Using proximity. Letting the contrast build on its own. The line goes quiet. Because that strategy, quiet repositioning, passive contrast, soft shadow framing, is far more dangerous than any direct attack. Direct attacks are predictable. You can defend against them. But narrative gravity? You can't stop that. You can only reposition before it pulls you in. The voice on the other end finally responds. So what's the next move? And the Virginia man gives an answer that feels less like analysis and more like prophecy. Nothing loud. Nothing public. They're going to let the media amplify the tension naturally. Trump will stay above it, but his orbit will keep bending the narrative around her. Another silence. This one heavier. Then the voice speaks again, low, calculated, measured. If this continues, she's going to become the unintended center of a national contrast arc. Exactly, the man replies. And that's the point. Not to weaken her, but to clarify him. There it is. The line between politics and storytelling dissolving. Because in high-level strategic communication, candidates aren't just competing on issues. They're competing on definition. On who gets to be the symbol, and who becomes the counterweight to that symbol. The call ends. No names used. No commitments made. Just two people acknowledging a shift in the air, like sensing a storm before the first drop of rain. The man sets the phone down, stares out the window, and watches the quiet Virginia night as if it's holding a secret. Because it is. Tomorrow, this shift will enter a new phase. Tomorrow, more people will notice the contrast forming. Tomorrow, the whispers will get louder. But tonight, the story moves forward because one call was made. And nobody, not the public, not the press, not even most of Congress, will ever know it happened. By morning, Washington feels different. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just, tighter. Like the air has shifted 1 degree, and only the people who live in this world can sense it. You felt this before. That moment when a story begins moving on its own. The Capitol dome glows under a soft winter haze as staffers hurry across the plaza. Most have no idea what changed overnight. But a few do. They move faster. They speak quieter. They avoid eye contact. Because they know when the drift begins. No one can stop where it leads. Inside the Cannon building, a junior aide pauses at the end of a hallway. She's holding a stack of briefing folders, but her eyes are locked on her phone. A message from a senior strategist flashes across the screen. Watch Omar's committees today. Behavioral variances expected. Behavioral variances. Only Washington could take something human and make it sound mechanical. She tucks the phone away and almost bumps into a colleague rounding the corner. You see the chatter? He asks. She nods. They say something's moving. He exhales, glancing around. They don't move this kind of narrative unless someone upstream wants it moved. There it is. A quiet admission. A truth whispered across generations of Washington insiders. Not everything that happens in politics is planned. But almost nothing is accidental. Across the street, in the Capitol itself, a security officer opens the chamber doors just as a cluster of reporters pass by. And one of them, a veteran Hill correspondent, leans toward her producer. Do you feel that? She says. Feel what? This tension. Threads pulling that shouldn't be pulling. Someone's pushing a storyline, but they're doing it without saying anything. Her producer shrugs. But she knows. She's been here long enough to recognize a narrative pivot, especially one that tries this hard to look organic. Meanwhile, Ilhan Omar steps into a committee prep room. She doesn't know about the call from Virginia. She doesn't know that strategists across the city spent the night recalculating her trajectory. She doesn't know that she's becoming the quiet center of a contrast arc designed by someone she hasn't even spoken to. But she feels something. The way the staffers look at her. The way conversations pause when she enters. The way the air carries that subtle charge. The one that tells you you've been placed under a different light. She sits. Takes a breath. Opens her folder. But she can't shake the sense that the walls around her are shifting. Not closing in. Just, rearranging. Across the Capitol, in a private office near the Speaker's suite, an older policy advisor reviews a series of overnight message tests. He's seen hundreds of these over the years. But today's data is different. Trump's positioning. Omar's reactions. Media tone. Public sentiment. Separate, none of it means much. Together, they form a convergence he wasn't expecting until months later. He mutters under his breath. They've accelerated the clock. Then he makes a note. Not for a politician, but for a communications architect higher up the chain. Trajectory shift confirmed. Monitor alignment. Contrast rising organically. And there it is again. That word. Contrast. Not attack. Not conflict. Not confrontation. Contrast. Because in American politics, contrast is the most powerful narrative tool ever invented. It turns candidates into symbols. Issues into identities. Moments into movements. And today on Capitol Hill, that contrast is growing quietly. Like a shadow stretching 1 inch longer every hour. But no one knows where it's leading. Not yet. And the real story? It still hasn't started. It starts with a ping. A single notification inside a windowless analytics room 6 blocks from the Capitol, where the lights never turn off, and the people inside rarely speak above a whisper. Most Americans don't know this place exists. They think political momentum is built on speeches, headlines, or fiery moments on cable news. But the real momentum, the kind that changes how the country feels, begins here. In numbers. In patterns. In the quiet tremors before the earthquake. A young analyst named Carter glances at the screen. His job is simple. Find the shifts. Before anyone else sees them. And this morning, he sees one. A trend line he's been monitoring for weeks, one that barely moved, barely breathed, suddenly jumps. Not a spike. Not a collapse. Something more subtle. A reversal. Trump's public sentiment graph angles upward in a way that isn't tied to a speech, a rally, or a headline. It's tied to proximity. To narrative adjacency. Strange, he murmurs. At the same moment, another line moves. Not down, but sideways. Ilhan Omar's sentiment doesn't drop. It polarizes. 2 clusters form. One colder. One hotter. Both stronger. Carter leans back in his chair. You don't see that kind of divergence without outside framing pressure, he whispers to himself. He flags the pattern. He runs the model again. Same result. Then he uses the term no analyst wants to use unless they're absolutely certain. Irregular convergence. It isn't hostile. It isn't engineered internally. But it has direction. A gravitational pull. A storyline forming from the outside. One neither Omar nor her team initiated. Carter reports it up the chain. 10 minutes later, his supervisor calls a secure briefing. And that's when the real tension begins. In a conference room filled with glowing screens, 3 senior analysts gather around a table. They've seen manufactured narratives before. They've seen organic ones, too. But this? This sits in the uncanny space between. The oldest analyst, Marin, taps her finger on the table. There's no hostile op running, she says. No troll bursts. No bot surges. No adversarial signature. This isn't an attack. Carter responds. Right. But it's not neutral either. Something is shaping perception just by existing. He highlights 2 lines on the screen. Trump's quiet climb. Omar's polarization spread. Look at this. They're becoming narrative mirrors. A younger analyst frowns. Mirrors how? Not on policy. Not on ideology. On definition. People are starting to define one through the lens of the other. That word again. Definition. The invisible battlefield almost no one sees. Because in modern American storytelling, definition is destiny. The analysts run scenarios. Who benefits? Who loses? Who controls the gravity here? None of the models predict a direct clash. In fact, the strongest scenario shows something stranger. A long-form contrast arc. Where Trump's image gains stability by standing adjacent, not against, Omar. And Omar's narrative becomes more intense simply by being placed in Trump's silhouette. Not a collision. A calibration. Marin studies the projected heat map and finally says, "This isn't a campaign move." Carter looks up. "You're sure?" She nods. Campaigns push. This pulls. This is the kind of shift that happens when someone understands narrative influence deeper than the political class does. Someone. Not a party. Not a team. Not a consultant. Someone. And in that single moment, the analysts realize something that no headline, no pundit, and no staffer has understood yet. The story forming between Trump and Omar isn't an accident. But it also isn't loud enough to identify. It's the kind of move you only notice when you know where to look. Like a shadow appearing before you ever see the person casting it. Marin closes the report and says what everyone in the room is now thinking. We're not tracking a conflict. We're tracking a shift in narrative energy. A pause. And we're already behind. Outside, the DC afternoon glows gold against the marble buildings. Staffers hurry. Reporters chase tips. Politicians rehearse talking points. No one knows that deep underground, a small team has just detected the beginning of a fault line. Quiet. Subtle. Dangerous. A story moving faster than the people inside it. And the real question forming now isn't about Trump. Or Omar. Or Capitol Hill. It's about the unseen architect shaping the space between them. The person whose fingerprints are on the story. Without ever leaving a trace. It begins with a rumor. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that races across social media or explodes on cable news. This rumor travels differently. Through hallways, not headlines. Through nods, not notifications. Through conversations that start with one sentence. Hey, did you hear? By mid-afternoon, the whisper network is alive. Staffers hear it first. Then legislative directors. Then senior advisors. Not a scandal. Not a leak. A question. The kind that creeps into a room long before anyone knows where it came from. Is Trump doing something with Omar? No accusation. No specifics. Just an unease growing like a low-pressure front over Washington. Because this town knows how to smell a narrative shift. Even when it can't yet see the storm. Inside the Rayburn cafeteria, a table of interns eat in silence until one finally blurts out. My supervisor told me to monitor Omar's committee mentions. Like, specifically her. Why? Another intern shrugs. Committee stuff changes all the time. But a third one shakes her head. No, this feels different. They told us to watch the tone, not the content. That's messaging side work, not policy side. The interns go quiet. Tone. Not content. That's when people in Washington start paying attention. Across the Capitol, two mid-level communications staffers step into an alcove near a column, an unofficial privacy booth known to staffers but ignored by tourists. You hearing the same thing? One asks. The other leans in. Everyone's hearing it. Trump's people aren't attacking. They're framing. Quietly. Indirectly. It's not about policy or votes. It's something deeper. The first staffer lowers her voice. But what's the endgame? If it's not a hit, then what? And the second staffer gives the answer that's been floating through every back channel all day. Contrast. Pure contrast. The most effective kind. One you don't even notice until you're already reacting to it. They both exhale. Because they know what contrast arcs do. Not to campaigns. But to people. Contrast arcs define personalities. They pull emotions. They push perceptions. They build clarity by letting the audience fill in the blanks themselves. And when done well, they don't just shift the narrative. They take ownership of it. Meanwhile, in a secure office 3 floors above, a senior Democratic strategist closes the blinds and sits across from a colleague who looks more rattled than he should. "I need you to level with me," she says. "What's actually happening out there?" He slides a tablet across the table. On the screen, charts. Heat maps. Sentiment gradients. None dramatic. All significant. He explains. Trump isn't escalating. He isn't pressuring. He isn't overtly targeting. He's doing something more, unorthodox. She raises an eyebrow. Define unorthodox. Using Omar's presence as a pivot. Not her policies. Not her statements. Her symbol. He's using adjacency to rebuild his narrative gravity. She studies him. And what does she get? A magnified identity. Stronger support on one end. Stronger opposition on the other. He pauses. It's not a hit. It's a pull. Her stomach tightens. Because a pull is more dangerous than a push. Push makes headlines. Pull makes momentum. In a studio 2 miles away, a television producer watches the day's political chatter forming on social feeds. Something catches her attention. Trump and Omar's names appearing in the same comment clusters, even when the posts have nothing to do with either of them. That's not normal. That's narrative spillover. She leans back. Someone's weaving a pattern, she whispers. A soft bind. A shadow storyline. Her assistant overhears. What does that even mean? The producer doesn't answer. She's too busy seeing where this could lead. Because when 2 figures begin to share narrative gravity, the media will eventually amplify it. Even unintentionally. And once amplification starts, the story becomes self-sustaining. At sunset, the whispers intensify. Not louder. Just more inevitable. People across Washington start to feel it. A story forming without direction. A tension rising without conflict. A connection deepening without contact. A quiet magnetic force linking 2 figures. One through visibility. The other through inevitability. Nobody knows who started it. Nobody knows why. But they all feel the same thing. This isn't random. This isn't accidental. This is the beginning of a narrative alignment. One subtle enough to ignore. One powerful enough to reshape the months ahead. And the real story? It still hasn't revealed itself. Not yet. Every major narrative shift in Washington eventually produces the same question. Okay, but who's behind it? Not the surface players. Not the voices on TV. Not the strategists who take public credit after the fact. The real architects move differently. They don't announce. They don't posture. They don't campaign. They influence the air around the story. Not the story itself. And tonight, Washington begins to sense that someone like that is moving. Quietly. Precisely. Deliberately. Not for chaos. Not for attack. Not even for advantage. For alignment. At a townhouse in Georgetown, the lights are low. A former communications director, someone who once held enormous power before choosing to disappear, sits alone at a small wooden table. Her name is Evelyn Shaw. Most people in D.C. don't know her. They shouldn't. That's by design. But the people who do know her, they treat her like a myth. Because Evelyn doesn't run campaigns. She runs narrative environments. Not by pushing messages. But by bending context. By shifting the lighting around a story. Until the characters inside it look different. Tonight, Evelyn reads a brief sent anonymously by a junior aide who once interned under her. It contains the same anomalies the analysts found earlier. A soft rise on Trump's side. A polarization spread on Omar's side. A growing contrast arc that no one can fully explain. She reads quietly, expressionless. Then she whispers. Someone's using adjacency strategy. She closes the report and rests her fingers on the table. Adjacency strategy isn't common. It's not taught. It's not written down. It's felt. The idea is simple but powerful. You don't attack your opponent. You don't even address your opponent. You merely exist in a space close enough that the public begins comparing both of you. Subconsciously. And during that comparison, narrative gravity does the rest. Whichever figure feels clearer, steadier, more defined, becomes the anchor. The other becomes the contrast. Not the villain. Not the threat. The counterweight. A role they never asked for. But cannot escape. Evelyn exhales slowly. Whoever is doing this, she murmurs, knows exactly what they're creating. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, in a dimly lit basement workspace, a political data hobbyist, someone with no official role but an unusual talent for spotting patterns, refreshes his dashboard. And what he sees makes him sit up straight. Keyword pairs. Media adjacency. Cross-cluster resonance. Trump mentions appearing under Omar stories. Omar mentions appearing under Trump stories. Not artificially. Not forced. Just drifting together. Like 2 currents merging in a river that no one realized connected underground. He whispers. This is engineered narrative gravity. He prints the chart, circles 3 data clusters, and writes one phrase across the top. Who is pulling the threads? But the truth is this. No one sees the architect. Because the architect isn't acting directly. They're acting around the story. Not drawing lines. Removing them. Not amplifying conflict. Amplifying contrast. Not pushing a message. Letting perception breathe until it forms its own shape. And that kind of influence doesn't feel like politics. It feels like inevitability. Back on Capitol Hill, a congressman stands at his office window, watching the city lights flare awake. He doesn't know about Evelyn. He doesn't know about the data hobbyist. He doesn't know about the analysts underground. But he feels the same thing they all feel. A drift he can't name. A shift he can't trace. A narrative weight moving through the city like a change in barometric pressure. His chief of staff knocks. Sir, there's chatter. About Omar. About Trump. Something's forming. He turns around. What kind of something? She hesitates. That's the problem. No one knows. He steps closer. Leans against the desk. Are they fighting? He asks. No. Are they messaging against each other? No. He frowns. Then what the hell is happening? She finally gives the only answer possible. A presence. A framing. A shadow alignment. He looks back out the window. And that's when the thought hits him. One so uncomfortable. And yet so undeniable. That he can't ignore it. Whatever is building between Trump and Omar might not be building between them at all. It might be built around them. By someone invisible. Someone patient. Someone brilliant. Someone who understands that the most powerful move in politics is the one no one sees you make. And the real story? It's only now coming into focus. Everything in politics has a first domino. Sometimes it's loud. A speech. A tweet. A scandal that sets cameras ablaze. But sometimes it's silent. A folder left on a desk. A line in a chart. A conversation that vanishes before anyone notices it happened. And this is one of those times. By mid-morning, the subtle currents that have been rippling through Capitol Hill overnight begin to solidify. Staffers sense it. Reporters sense it. Even politicians, moving between meetings, feel it, the quiet weight of a shift forming beneath the surface. Not yet visible. Not yet undeniable. But inevitable. The first domino falls quietly. A minor tweet. One that references Omar in passing, but the context is carefully curated. Not hostile. Not supportive. Just a factoid, framed adjacent to a subtle contrast about leadership. Nothing explosive. Nothing dramatic. But the analysts notice. They lean into the screens. They see the spike begin, small, almost invisible to anyone else. But measurable. Directional. Intentional. And that's when whispers in the hallways accelerate. What just happened? Did you see that post? It's everywhere, but it's nothing. Exactly. Nothing. And yet everything. Because in narrative strategy, the first domino is rarely the most important. It's the one that proves the mechanism works. That sets the expectation of movement. That tells every observer, even subconsciously, how to interpret the next moments. In committee offices, aides notice conversations veering slightly. Meetings that would normally run in routine fashion now carry a tension nobody can explain. Body language changes. Pauses lengthen. Subtle glances are exchanged. The drift is spreading. And it's working. Across town, Evelyn Shaw sits in her dimly lit Georgetown townhouse. She doesn't need the analytics to tell her what's happening. She predicted the first domino. She anticipated its placement. She knew exactly where it would fall. Her fingers hover over her notes, making minor adjustments, tweaks to the timing of narrative nudges, recalibrations of contrast arcs. Not manipulation. Precision. Because narrative gravity doesn't require chaos. It only requires order in invisible places. Meanwhile, in the Capitol press offices, reporters begin noticing patterns. Not trends in polling. Not policy shifts. Not scandal. Patterns of connection. Of adjacency. Of attention being quietly steered. Why are Trump and Omar being mentioned together? One reporter mutters. Is it intentional, or coincidence? Another asks. The difference is subtle, but it matters. Coincidence is powerless. Intentionality is gravity. And the first domino has already started pulling everything else forward. By late afternoon, the hallways, the press rooms, the committee offices, all of Washington, begin to feel the first hint of alignment. People don't know why. They don't know who. They just know the air has changed. The real story hasn't even started. But the first domino has fallen. And once the first domino falls, every other one will follow. By late afternoon, the first domino begins its work. It's subtle at first. A handful of social media posts. A few retweets. Minor blog commentary. Nothing the public would consider remarkable. Nothing that triggers outrage. But to the analysts, it's the signal. A ripple in the water. A microhook. A pattern forming. Across multiple platforms, the mentions of Trump and Omar begin to intersect. Not in debate. Not in attack. But in juxtaposition. One post highlights his leadership. Another post references her policy stance. Separately, trivial. Together, a silent contrast emerges. The narrative begins self-amplifying. The analysts lean closer. Charts spike subtly, almost imperceptibly. Algorithms begin to push visibility, not because of engagement, but because of pattern weight. The more people notice, the more the system nudges attention their way. It's invisible. It's precise. It's beautiful. Inside a committee office, aides notice the shift. Conversations start to reference Omar in passing, almost instinctively, whenever Trump is mentioned. They feel a subtle pull, a gravitational alignment. And reporters begin to see it too. They're being mentioned together more, a young journalist says, scrolling through her notes. Her senior editor leans in. Not in conflict. In context, he says. That's the story. But who's writing it? Exactly. Nobody is. The narrative is emerging on its own. Meanwhile, Evelyn Shaw monitors the flow from her townhouse. Her eyes are sharp. Her mind is calm. Every post. Every subtle comparison. Every algorithmic push aligns with the plan she anticipated weeks ago. Not chaos. Precision. A crescendo of attention, without anyone realizing it. She whispers to herself. They're watching the story. But they think they're leading it. By evening, Capitol Hill begins to feel the pull. Staffers shift their priorities. Meetings realign. Aides subtly adjust talking points. Even lawmakers find themselves reacting to the narrative instead of controlling it. You know this feeling. That moment when the world feels like it's moving on its own, but you're the one inside it, trying to keep pace. Screens flicker. Phones buzz. Voices rise and fall in cadence with unseen forces. And somewhere, above the hum of fluorescent lights and conversation, someone, some architect, some strategist, watches quietly. Because in narrative gravity, the amplification stage is the most dangerous. It's when perception begins to own reality. And the real story? It's just beginning to roar. By nightfall, Capitol Hill feels like a city at a threshold. Not chaotic. Not alarmed. Just, aware. Something is shifting. Something unseen. Something inevitable. You felt it before, the moment when the currents of events converge, and you realize the next step will define everything that follows. This is that moment. Inside a dimly lit committee office, aides sit with folders and phones, trying to make sense of the day. Reports overlap. Mentions rise. Patterns twist in ways that defy ordinary logic. One aide whispers, it's like they're moving themselves, without anyone touching them. Another shakes her head. I've seen data before. I've tracked messaging before. But this is different. It isn't a clash. It isn't a scandal. It's alignment. A slow, gravitational pull drawing narratives together without anyone consciously pulling the strings. Meanwhile, outside the Capitol dome, the city hums under streetlights. Journalists debate stories in coffee shops. Interns glance at social feeds. Staffers notice trends but cannot name them. A young reporter finally says, it's not a story yet, but it's becoming one. And that's the crux. A story doesn't need a headline to exist. It only needs direction. Inside a private office, Evelyn Shaw monitors multiple dashboards. Her hand hovers over a tablet. Her fingers twitch over the touch screen, ready to nudge if necessary. But tonight, she does nothing. Because the story has reached the crossroads. It can advance on its own. Every signal, every contrast, every microhook she has orchestrated is now self-propelling. She leans back. A shadow across her face. A faint smile. Not triumph. Not arrogance. Just recognition. This is where influence becomes invisible. Where control doesn't look like control. Where power whispers and perception obeys. Across the hill, a senior lawmaker reviews the patterns emerging. Something's forming, he murmurs to his aide. Something beyond politics. Beyond committees. Beyond messaging. His aide nods, uncertain. Yes, it feels like inevitability. The lawmaker leans back. The narrative is moving itself, he says. And we're all just along for the ride. Outside, the lights of the city stretch toward the horizon. Washington has never felt smaller, yet heavier. Every person inside, from journalists to interns, from lawmakers to staffers, senses a shift in narrative gravity, a pull that hints at clarity, conflict, and consequence, all at once. And in that quiet tension, one truth becomes undeniable. The storm is no longer approaching. It's here. And everyone, willingly or not, is standing at the crossroads it created. At the heart of every narrative shift, there is a pulse. Not visible. Not audible. But you feel it if you're paying attention. A subtle rhythm beneath the headlines. A quiet heartbeat beneath the optics. A force guiding perception long before anyone realizes they are being guided. By midnight, Capitol Hill is mostly empty. Floors that were loud with whispers and papers hours ago are now silent. But the pulse remains. It vibrates through offices, hallways, and conference rooms. Staffers glance at screens, noticing patterns they can't explain. Reporters check feeds, sensing a momentum that isn't tied to a story yet. Lawmakers pause, feeling the gravity tug subtly on decisions they haven't even made. It's invisible. It's unstoppable. Deep in a basement workspace, the analysts are awake. Carter leans forward, eyes glued to the monitors. He points at a line graph. See that? The engagement isn't random. It's echoing across multiple clusters simultaneously. Marin nods. Not only that. The trajectory matches the contrast arc we predicted. Someone, or something, is orchestrating attention without appearing to do so. Carter exhales. You mean, a narrative engine? Exactly, Marin says. And we're just starting to feel its pulse. Meanwhile, in Georgetown, Evelyn Shaw sits quietly at her table. The room is dark, except for the glow of a laptop. She doesn't move. She doesn't speak. She watches. Every microhook. Every adjacency. Every subtle shift in perception is exactly where she predicted it would be. She whispers. The pulse is alive. And it's guiding them all. Across the city, journalists begin noticing anomalies. Small patterns. Juxtapositions they didn't intend. Mentions of Trump and Omar cropping up together in ways that feel deliberate, yet nobody knows why. They post tentative headlines. Tweets. Stories with questions, not conclusions. And the pulse absorbs them. It doesn't resist. It incorporates. It moves faster, more fluid, more inevitable. The system is self-propelling. By 2 a.m., the city sleeps. But the narrative pulse doesn't. It flows through the chambers, the offices, the homes of those who unknowingly participate in its rhythm. It bends attention. It clarifies contrast. It sets up the next domino without breaking a sweat. And in that quiet darkness, one thought hangs over Washington like a shadow. This is no ordinary story. This is something larger. Something meticulous. Something alive. A pulse that nobody sees. Yet everybody feels. And the real story? It hasn't yet revealed its first blow. By early morning, the city feels charged. Not with chaos. Not with alarm. But with inevitability. Every office, every newsroom, every committee room begins to sense it, the invisible hand guiding the day's narrative. It doesn't shout. It doesn't force. It simply shapes. Inside the Capitol, aides shuffle papers and adjust schedules. They can't explain why certain conversations happen at specific times. Why certain meetings are suddenly more urgent. Why mentions of Omar seem to shadow Trump without anyone orchestrating it publicly. They feel the gravity but not the source. You've experienced this before. A room, a moment, a pattern that feels too orderly to be coincidence. That is the invisible hand. 3 blocks away, Evelyn Shaw monitors dashboards in near silence. She doesn't control the hand. She doesn't need to. She set the mechanisms months ago: microhooks, contrast arcs, adjacency strategies. Now, the hand moves through the system effortlessly. Through algorithms. Through perception. Through the quiet attention of 1 million Americans unknowingly participating in her design. She whispers. The architecture is complete. The hand moves itself now. In a data lab, Carter and Marin sit among blinking monitors. Look at the clusters, Carter says, pointing. They're converging again. Not by accident. Not by direct messaging. But by influence over perception itself. Marin nods. You're seeing narrative gravity in action. Subtle. Invisible. Relentless. They watch, quiet, knowing the impact will ripple through politics, media, and public opinion before anyone can name it. Back on the Hill, reporters tweet tentative connections. Trump and Omar mentions increasing together, coincidence or strategy? Their posts get amplified not by viral outrage, but by attention inertia. By subtle algorithmic nudges. By human curiosity. The invisible hand absorbs everything. Every report. Every chart. Every whispered question. And it continues to shape the narrative arc with precision no public official could match. By noon, the pulse, the hand, the silent gravity all converge. Washington is moving. But not by debate. Not by speeches. Not by scandal. It moves by design. By architecture. By the subtle influence of someone who never needs recognition. And the real story? It is now unavoidable. A narrative built in shadows, pulling the country toward a confrontation that looks spontaneous, but is anything but. The invisible hand has set the stage. And soon, everyone will feel its weight. The day has arrived. Not with chaos. Not with a bang. But with inevitability. The invisible hand, the pulse, the contrast arcs, all converge here, on Capitol Hill, in every newsroom, in the minds of Americans who don't yet know they're watching a story unfold like a quiet machine. This is the moment where strategy becomes reality. Ilhan Omar steps into a hearing room. She doesn't know how carefully the narrative has been prepared around her. She doesn't know how Trump's orbit has been subtly aligned to create contrast, to define him through her presence without conflict, without attack. But she feels it. The eyes. The whispers. The weight of a story that seems larger than anyone in the room. You felt this before. That moment when the world moves slightly differently because someone unseen, has shaped the context around you. In a quiet office, Evelyn Shaw watches the unfolding events. Nothing is left to chance. The mechanisms she built months ago hum quietly in the background. Microhooks, adjacency, narrative gravity, they have done their work. The public perceives spontaneity. The media perceives coincidence. The politicians perceive reaction. All of it, perfectly orchestrated. She leans back. This is it, she whispers. The apex. Across Washington, reporters scramble to cover the hearing. Analysts update their dashboards. Staffers try to anticipate every turn. But none of them can control the story anymore. They are moving inside it, carried by its weight, its pull, its invisible architecture. Because the narrative is no longer about tweets, committees, or speeches. It's about definition. About contrast. About perception itself. Trump's orbit appears steady, deliberate, calm. Omar's presence sharpens, amplifies, polarizes. Neither is attacking. Both are participating. And the invisible hand ensures the audience is watching, comparing, reacting, and defining for themselves who they see, who they support, and who they oppose. The pulse reaches its peak. Washington pauses for a brief moment, a breath, a heartbeat, a collective recognition of something unprecedented in its subtlety. Not a scandal. Not an explosion. A revelation. The power of narrative, exercised quietly. The shaping of attention, influence, and perception without a single word spoken aloud. This is how influence looks when it is perfect. Invisible. Inevitable. Irresistible. As the hearing concludes, Omar leaves the room. Trump delivers a statement elsewhere, calm, controlled. The media will frame the story. The public will interpret it. Politicians will react. But the story, the real story, has already been written. Not on paper. Not in headlines. But in the way people perceive, connect, and define the figures at the center. And in that quiet architecture, the truth becomes clear. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it moves the world without anyone realizing. And maybe, just maybe, this is where everything begins again. The Capitol is quiet now. Not because the story ended. But because its echo lingers. After the hearings, the briefings, the data spikes, and the invisible hand's orchestration, Washington breathes differently. Something unseen has moved through the city. A shadow of influence, leaving subtle changes in its wake. You know this feeling. When the air carries tension you cannot name. When everyone senses a story has shifted. But no one knows where it started, or who truly pulled the strings. Inside committee offices, staffers glance at one another. Eyes flicker toward phones. Screens refresh. Graphs move quietly upward. It's still happening, a junior aide whispers. No one's done yet. Indeed. It's never over. Not until perception solidifies. Not until people have fully absorbed the contrast arc, the adjacency strategy, the narrative gravity that moved silently through months of preparation. Outside, journalists debate in coffee shops, comparing notes, headlines, and social threads. Each story feels like coincidence. Each analysis feels independent. But it's not. The story, the narrative pulse, has already set the frame. And now, it waits for the public to catch up. It's a test of attention. A demonstration of influence. A lesson in the quiet art of shaping perception. Evelyn Shaw observes it all from her low-lit Georgetown apartment. Her eyes track the ripple across dashboards, social feeds, and news cycles. She doesn't need recognition. She doesn't need applause. She only observes. The shadow she cast continues to stretch. The story moves as she predicted. Only now, it moves with a momentum she no longer has to push. She leans back, letting the quiet pulse of the city remind her. The most powerful influence is the one people never see coming. The one they participate in willingly, without knowing they are being guided. Meanwhile, across Washington, lawmakers sense it too. Not in speeches. Not in emails. Not in data briefings. But in the way meetings shift. The way questions are asked. The way staffers pause, aware of a momentum that is larger than any one person in the room. They feel the shadow of influence. And they know it's permanent, at least for now. The public does not yet know the story. They only see fragments, tweets, headlines, soundbites. And that is exactly how it was designed. Because the invisible hand doesn't seek attention. It seeks definition. It seeks contrast. It seeks to guide the collective perception until the narrative aligns with its architecture. And as the day fades, one thing becomes certain. The story has changed. The balance has shifted. And the players, whether they know it or not, will move inside the shadow of a story that was never theirs to control. Washington sleeps. But the pulse continues. The shadow remains. And somewhere, quietly, the architect smiles, knowing the world is moving exactly as planned. And the real story? It's only just begun. By sunrise, the quiet has ended. Not with a bang. Not with fireworks. But with attention. The Capitol hums differently today. The whispers from yesterday have hardened into questions. The shadow that moved unseen now flickers in every headline, every cable news panel, every scrolling feed. And the public is noticing. Reporters chase fragments. Analysts scramble to verify trends. Lawmakers adjust talking points mid-sentence. And in the center of it all, without attacking, without confronting, Trump and Omar exist together in a narrative frame carefully constructed, yet appearing spontaneous. The architecture is invisible. But the effect is undeniable. On the Hill, an aide leans toward her senior. People are talking about them together, everywhere. Her senior nods slowly. Yes. It's not conflict. It's contrast. It's alignment without friction. And the public, they're eating it up without realizing it. It's the perfect storm of perception. In a studio, anchors debate side by side. Is this coincidence, or looks intentional, but subtle? No one can say for sure. And that's the genius of it. Uncertainty drives engagement. Curiosity fuels attention. And the invisible architect remains unseen, directing the flow from the shadows. Evelyn Shaw observes, calm and deliberate. The public spark is everything she anticipated. The microhooks have triggered. The cognitive loops are active. The audience is participating in a narrative they think is organic. She leans back in her chair. The moment of ignition, she whispers. The first wave is self-propelling. Across Washington, lawmakers feel the shift. The story now exists beyond committee walls. Beyond analytics labs. Beyond whispered rumors. It exists in perception. In social comparison. In every conversation, every headline, every fleeting thought of the American public. And the real question is no longer, what happened? It's, what happens next? The Capitol dome glows in the morning sun. The city moves faster, louder, aware but unsure. The narrative has sparked. And just like that, a story that began in whispers now commands attention, without a single word of overt conflict. The invisible hand is no longer invisible. It is felt. It is powerful. It is unstoppable. By late morning, the spark has ignited a fire. Not literal. Not violent. But perceptual. Washington is awake now. Not just the city. But the people inside it who understand that something unusual is happening. And they are reacting. Inside committee rooms, lawmakers shuffle papers, adjust schedules, and confer quietly. Have you seen this coverage? One asks. His colleague leans over. Yes. Everyone's framing Trump and Omar together. Not attacking, just paired. The first lawmaker frowns. It's influencing perception. Subtly. Everywhere. Subtle. That is the operative word. Staffers feel the pressure without fully understanding it. Calls come in. Meetings are requested. Analysts deliver charts that only partly explain the trend. And yet everyone feels it. The narrative is no longer controllable. It is alive. It moves faster than memos. It moves faster than talking points. You felt this too. The moment when control slips. And all you can do is react. In a TV studio, analysts debate live. It's remarkable, one says. You don't see attacks, yet the public perceives comparison. Another nods. Exactly. It's adjacency strategy in motion. Contrast without conflict. And the audience is participating willingly. The anchors exchange glances. The viewers at home see tension. They feel movement. And they don't even know the architect remains invisible. Meanwhile, Evelyn Shaw observes quietly from Georgetown. The first wave of reactions is exactly what she predicted. Lawmakers move inside the narrative. Media frames the story. Public attention magnifies without knowing why. She takes a breath. And now, she whispers. The cascade begins. Across D.C., junior staffers notice subtle shifts. Questions asked differently. Meetings scheduled differently. Even internal memos, designed to inform, are bending perception instead. The city hums with a tension that is not chaos. It is orchestration. It is subtle. It is precise. And in that orchestration, one truth becomes clear. The narrative has escaped the architect's immediate control. Not because it failed. But because it succeeded. The story now has momentum of its own. And everyone, from Capitol staffers to reporters to casual observers, is now moving inside it, reacting to signals they cannot name. The invisible hand has done its work. And the public? They are noticing. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to wonder. The first reactions are in. And the real game has just begun. By afternoon, the first cracks begin to show. Not in the story itself. Not yet. But in the people who thought they controlled it. Washington has a way of revealing itself. Small fissures appear in schedules, in briefings, in whispers between staffers. Moments where someone realizes the narrative isn't responding to them, it's moving around them. You've seen this before. That uneasy pause. That glance exchanged in a hallway. That question no one dares to ask aloud. Who's really in charge? Inside a conference room, mid-level aides gather around a screen showing trending clusters. It's diverging, one says. The analyst leans closer. No, it's converging, but not where we expected. The room goes quiet. They were expecting attacks. They were expecting headlines. They were expecting control. Instead, they are witnessing something more subtle. More precise. More unsettling. The narrative is alive. And it does not care about their expectations. Across the hill, lawmakers feel it too. Their talking points feel inadequate. Their briefings feel late. The calm confidence they carried this morning is replaced by tension. I can't tell if this is intentional or accidental, one murmurs to a colleague. His colleague shrugs. Does it matter? Either way, we're behind the curve. Meanwhile, Evelyn Shaw watches quietly from her apartment. The cracks are expected. Necessary. Part of the design. She doesn't panic. She doesn't intervene. The cracks are the proof of momentum. The subtle instability she seeded ensures the narrative cannot be contained by conventional means. It pushes people to react, not control. It sharpens contrast. It magnifies perception. She whispers to herself. Everything unfolds in the gaps people leave behind. By evening, the media begins to notice anomalies in coverage. Small contradictions. Unintended juxtapositions. Stories that don't fit neatly into the usual frames. And the public begins to feel it. Something is happening, but no one can define it. The cracks in the political landscape are not collapse. They are leverage. They are the pressure points that guide perception, subtly and invisibly. The Capitol grows quiet again. But the fissures remain. Because the story is no longer about individuals, committees, or speeches. It is about the invisible architecture of influence. The force that bends attention. The gravity that pulls perception without anyone noticing. The cracks appear. And with them, the narrative grows stronger. Night falls on Washington. Not with silence. Not with calm. But with expectation. The story that began in whispers, moved in shadows, and pulsed invisibly through Capitol Hill has reached its apex. The public sees fragments. Lawmakers feel shifts. Reporters chase threads they cannot fully trace. And above it all, the invisible hand, steady, patient, unseen, watches. Inside committee offices, the final reactions unfold. Staffers pause mid-task, realizing that every decision today, every statement, every micro-adjustment, has been influenced, not by conflict, not by debate, but by design. A junior aide murmurs. Did we ever even lead this story? Her colleague shakes his head. No. We just followed. Exactly. Following was the point. Perception is the game. Control is an illusion. Evelyn Shaw leans back in her low-lit apartment. The crescendo she engineered is complete. The adjacency arcs are perfect. The microhooks have triggered flawlessly. The narrative now moves itself, self-sustaining, unstoppable, unavoidable. She whispers to herself. Influence doesn't roar. It whispers. It shapes. It guides. And if it's done right, people follow willingly, believing they chose their own path. Across the city, the public reacts. They debate. They share. They comment. They see Trump and Omar together, linked, contrasted. They form opinions. They make judgments. All without realizing the architecture beneath the story, the invisible currents that guided their perception from the very beginning. In the quiet of the night, one truth becomes undeniable. Power is not always force. Control is not always authority. The most profound influence is subtle, invisible, and persistent. The story has reached its climax. Not with shouting. Not with spectacle. But with the quiet, relentless shaping of reality itself. And as the city sleeps, the echo remains. Stories move. Perceptions shift. Influence persists. The invisible hand does not rest. It watches. It waits. It begins again. Because the true power in Washington, in America, is not in what you see. It's in what you don't see. And maybe this is where everything begins again. The Capitol sleeps, but the story does not. Not in news feeds. Not in headlines. Not even in conversations that have died down. It echoes. A whisper through committees. A subtle reference in late-night commentary. A fleeting memory in the minds of the public. It is the aftershock of influence. The resonance of a narrative that moved quietly, invisibly, yet left every participant subtly changed. Evelyn Shaw watches the patterns continue from her apartment. She doesn't need to intervene. The echoes are self-sustaining now. They ripple through perception, memory, and attention, long after the immediate events have passed. She notes small anomalies. Clusters of conversation that continue to align. Unintended connections forming between unrelated discussions. Microhooks self-reinforcing. She smiles faintly. The pulse lingers, she whispers. And it will for weeks. Across Washington, aides and lawmakers feel it. An inexplicable shift in attention. Subtle influence on what is noticed, what is remembered. A narrative that refuses to fade. They are reacting to echoes now, not events. And in that reaction, perception itself is reshaped. In media rooms, journalists debate what happened yesterday, unaware of the invisible architecture behind it all. Was it coordinated? One asks. No, another replies. It just evolved. People are framing it themselves. Exactly. The story is now organic, growing in ways no one can trace. And outside, the public carries fragments, tweets, stories, impressions, without ever connecting them. But the echo is there. Subtle. Persistent. Shaping opinion, belief, and awareness without anyone consciously steering it. The narrative has transcended its origin. It no longer belongs to architects, politicians, or analysts. It belongs to perception itself. The real story? It isn't finished. It is echoing. Growing. Waiting for the next observer to step inside its rhythm. Washington thinks it slept through the night. But the story is awake. And it hums quietly, persistently, invisibly. The echoes have begun. Morning breaks over Washington, but the city feels heavier. Not because of events. Not because of announcements. But because of expectation. People sense it. A subtle tension moving through hallways, offices, and press rooms. The story's pulse has grown louder, though no one can locate its source. You felt this before, the moment when reality seems off-kilter. As if something larger is waiting just beyond perception. Inside committee offices, aides shuffle papers frantically. Did you see the new clusters? One asks, eyes wide. They're trending differently, another responds. Every mention is converging in ways we didn't plan. They feel the weight. Not control. Not chaos. Just pressure. The first cracks yesterday were minor. The echoes today are resonating. And resonance always amplifies tension. Across newsrooms, journalists debate. Trump and Omar mentions together again. Yes, but not attacks. Not conflict. Just contrast. And the audience is responding without realizing it. Exactly. Something is driving perception beneath the surface. The narrative has escaped conventional tracking. It moves like a current. It bends attention. It shapes reaction. In Georgetown, Evelyn Shaw leans back in her chair, watching dashboards flicker. She doesn't intervene. She doesn't need to. The tension is intentional. It focuses attention. It sharpens perception. It magnifies contrast. She whispers softly. When people feel pressure, they reveal themselves. When they think they're controlling, they're merely reacting. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers adjust schedules, alter talking points, even rethink speeches mid-conversation. The story's influence is no longer invisible, it is felt. Not by force. Not by command. But by gravity. A pull in the currents of attention, shaping decisions before anyone consciously chooses. By late afternoon, the tension reaches its peak. Staffers feel urgency. Reporters feel curiosity. Lawmakers feel exposure. And the public? They feel intrigue. All without chaos. All without confrontation. The story has moved from whisper to pulse to pressure. And soon, Washington will realize the truth. The narrative is not just a story. It is a force. And the rising tension is only the beginning. By evening, the tension that has been quietly building reaches its first visible point of impact. Not chaos. Not spectacle. But a subtle collision. The public begins to respond. Reporters amplify the narrative. Lawmakers notice shifts in attention. Everything that has been moving invisibly through Washington now brushes against reality, and the friction is palpable. In committee rooms, aides whisper urgently. People are tweeting comparisons. And they're sharing them faster than we anticipated. The senior staffer exhales. It's the first collision. They're reacting before we even brief them. This is the moment all invisible strategies risk exposure. The pulse has become a wave. The wave has become pressure. And the pressure is now noticeable. Across the city, journalists debate headlines in cafes and studios. Lawmakers notice shifts in attention. Everything that has been moving invisibly through Washington now brushes against reality, and the friction is palpable. In committee rooms, aides whisper urgently. People are tweeting comparisons. And they're sharing them faster than we anticipated. The senior staffer exhales. It's the first collision. They're reacting before we even brief them. This is the moment all invisible strategies risk exposure. The pulse has become a wave. The wave has become pressure. And the pressure is now noticeable. Across the city, journalists debate headlines in cafes and studios. Trump and Omar mentions trending simultaneously, one says. No attacks, just adjacency. And the audience is framing their own interpretations. A producer nods. That's the collision point. The narrative escapes the lab. The first cracks in the political landscape are no longer theoretical. They are visible. And every reaction now feeds the story itself. Meanwhile, Evelyn Shaw watches quietly from her apartment. This collision was expected. Necessary. Essential. Without it, momentum stagnates. Without it, perception stalls. The first collision triggers self-propelling attention, ensuring the narrative moves faster, more organically, and more powerfully than ever before. She murmurs. The wave must break before it shapes the shore. And now, it is breaking. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers notice public chatter affecting their schedules. Phone calls spike. Constituents ask questions. Staffers adjust talking points mid-meeting. The story has leapt from invisible design into active perception. No one controls it now. Everyone reacts to it. Outside, the public begins to interpret, compare, and share. The narrative is no longer a whisper. It is a current. A subtle, unstoppable force that shapes opinions before the observers even realize it exists. And in that first collision, one truth becomes undeniable. Stories don't just inform. They move. They influence. They define perception. And Washington has now felt its first undeniable impact. The first collision was quiet. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. But the effects ripple outward. Washington moves differently now. Reporters chase connections they cannot fully trace. Staffers adjust talking points they don't fully understand. Lawmakers react to trends they cannot control. The narrative has escaped the architect. It has gained momentum. Across newsrooms, the story spreads like wildfire without fire. Trump and Omar mentions rising together. People are framing their own narratives. Engagement is spiking without direct provocation. The audience doesn't know why. They only know what they see. And that is all the momentum needs. In Capitol offices, aides notice patterns accelerating. What's happening? It shouldn't move this fast, one whispers. A senior official leans over a screen. It's moving because perception is self-propelling, they say. And once momentum builds, it cannot be stopped. The realization hits slowly, but inevitably. Control was never fully theirs. They are now participants, not directors. Meanwhile, Evelyn Shaw watches from her apartment. The dashboards glow. The clusters pulse. The momentum she predicted is no longer fragile, it is unstoppable. She leans back, breathing slowly. The wave moves itself now, she murmurs. No interference required. The narrative is alive. Public reaction intensifies. Comments, shares, debates, and impressions all feed the story. Each person unknowingly contributes to the acceleration. Every microhook, every cognitive loop she seeded, activates again. The current grows stronger. Perception aligns. Contrast sharpens. Washington is no longer reacting, it is flowing with the momentum of a story that cannot be halted. By nightfall, the city hums differently. Phones buzz. Screens glow. Voices rise and fall in cadence with unseen forces. The first collision triggered motion. The wave gained momentum. And soon, everything in Washington will feel the full weight of the story she designed. Because momentum, once earned, feeds itself. And this story is only accelerating.